Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of John Thompson and the murder of Maggie Lieutand. Now, I'm not sure if I pronounced her name correctly, so do forgive me if I haven't. Maggie was also sometimes known as Mary, and the murder took place in Gateshead in 1901. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. Now, it is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. And this story, I have to say, is a little longer than normal, so I'm really hoping that I don't make any big mistakes close to the end and have to start again. Sadly, the backstory for those involved in this week's case has been almost impossible to find for John, so that will be quite basic, and the information for Maggie was not much better. John Thompson was said to be around 38 years old in 1901, so he would have been born in around 1863. He worked as an engine fitter and turner. He had worked in various different areas, including London, before returning to Gateshead in the spring of 1901 and taking a job at Armstrong's. He does not appear to have ever married or had any children, and on his return to Gateshead he had become friendly with Maggie Lieutand, and the couple had lived together for a time as man and wife. I did not find any mention of John being a man who was fond of the drink. Maggie Lieutand, the victim, often referred to, as said before, as Mary, was around 33 years old at the time of her death, so would have been born in around 1868. She was born in Salford to parents Henry and Mary, and was one of at least 3 children. She had previously been married, the marriage taking place in 1898, and her husband was a French sailor. The couple had not been happy together and had frequently argued, and they had been separated for several months. She had, as previously said, lived with John Thompson for a time, but this had not been a happy match either, and around 4 weeks before her death, she had left him and moved into rooms of her own in Gateshead. I did not find any details of any children from Maggie. Although none of her friends stated that she was fond of drinking, John at one point did accuse her of being a drunk. On September the 13th, 1901, John went to Maggie's home in Gateshead. She let him in and introduced him to the woman who she shared her rooms with, Ivy Dawson. After a short time, John said he wanted to talk to Maggie alone, but she said she did not want to and that she was about to go out to Newcastle. John left the house, but he was not happy at not being able to be alone with Maggie. Maggie and her friend Ivy set off for Newcastle a short time after this. They were soon alarmed to find that John was following them and watching where they went. The 2 women were worried about going home, but eventually returned around midnight, and they did not see John again that weekend. On the Monday morning, the 2 women went to Askew Road in Gateshead. When they got there, they found John standing near the post office waiting for them. He spoke to Maggie, saying he wanted to speak to her alone, and after she refused, John said he had a good mind to knock her head through the wall. The 2 women quickly walked away from him, and this time he did not follow them. The women then went to Byker to visit Maggie's sister, and on their return they noticed John heading back along Askew Road. They were on a tram at the time, and when they saw him, they decided to get off at a different stop and try to take a back road to their home, in the hope that he would not see them. However, when they got close to their home, they found John standing there waiting for them. Again he asked to speak to Maggie, and again she said no. They tried to get inside the house without him, but he forced his way inside. Then he took a revolver out of his pocket and aimed it at Maggie. Ivy noticed that there was another door open at the other side of the house, and Maggie ran towards it. And once outside, she ran over the road and managed to enter a passage for the house opposite, but John followed her and fired the gun twice, and Maggie fell to the ground. Ivy went to find a policeman and a doctor, and when the police arrived with Ivy and entered the passage, they found John holding Maggie's head in his arms. She was clearly seriously ill, and the doctor did not expect her to survive, and she died the following day, and John Thompson was arrested and charged for her willful murder. The inquest opened at Gateshead Police Court on September the 19th before Coroner Graham. Elizabeth Sample said she had identified the body as being that of her sister, Maggie Lieutand. She said Maggie's husband was a ship's cook, and she had heard that they had been living apart and that Maggie had been living in Gateshead. After the shooting, she said she had stayed with her sister in Millen Street until her death. Ivy Dawson said she was a friend of Maggie's and also lived with her. She said she had known her since before she was married, when she used to live in Addison Road in Heaton. She said she had only lived with Maggie for around 2 weeks, and she had not met John Thompson until the Friday before the murder, when he had called at the house. She had heard Maggie talk of him before, but this was the first time she had ever seen him. She said Maggie let him in and introduced him to her. She said Maggie was very cool with him, and when he asked to speak to her alone, she had refused, saying that she was going to go out to Newcastle. Ivy said Maggie went into the bedroom and John followed her, so she came back out immediately. She said she then put her hat on as if she was ready to go out, and John wished them both a good night and left. Ivy said John did not seem too happy that Maggie was going out, and she said that they did go out as soon as John had left. At around 10 p.m. or possibly 11 p.m, as Ivy said she was not sure of the time, she said they saw John in Granger Street in Newcastle. She said they did pass him and say nothing, but after this he seemed to be following them, and she said they saw him several more times that night. And Ivy said that they did not go home until midnight, as Maggie was scared to go sooner in case John had followed them. But Ivy continued, saying that they did not see him that weekend, and the next time she had seen John was on the following Monday morning at around 10:30 a.m, and she said she was with Maggie in Askew Road in Gateshead, and they were simply posting a letter. And John, who had been standing beside the post office, came over and said to Maggie that he wanted to speak to her alone. She said Maggie told him, "I don't want to speak to you. If you let things drop, I will let things drop." She said John had replied, "You are a drunken liar and only tell the truth by accident," and he then added, "I have a good mind to knock your head through the wall." Ivy said she had told him that he must not do that. She said she didn't know the full details, but she believed that Maggie had said something about John's mother, and that he had not been happy with what she had said, and she thought that this may be what he had wanted to speak to her about. She said they had both walked away quickly, leaving John standing by the post office. She said later they went to Biker, and when they returned by tram, she had seen John on Askew Road and told Maggie he was there. She said they got off a little further away and tried to return by a different route, but John had found them. Once again he asked to speak to Maggie alone, and she told him to go away. Ivy said she spoke to John and said, "Be a man and go away, the girl does not want to talk to you." She said they walked quicker towards their house, but so did John. Ivy said that when they got to the door, she had the key and unlocked it and tried to push Maggie inside, turning to John and saying, "What do you want? You can't come in." But she said he pushed past her and got inside. He then ran up several steps towards their rooms, but she got hold of his coat collar and pulled him back down. She said they both tried to force him back outside. After this, she said it was hard to remember what had happened next, as it was all so fast. She said she thought they were outside, and she saw John take something from inside his coat. She heard the sound of a shot and told Maggie to run for her life to the house opposite, and she said Maggie did this. She saw the revolver then, and John was aiming it at Maggie. Ivy said she was scared and went back inside and shut the door. She did not see what happened next, but she did hear the sound of 2 more shots just a few minutes later, and she said that it was then that she ran out to look for a policeman. She ended by saying that when she came back with the policeman and they entered the house opposite, they found John with Maggie in his arms on the floor, and she saw blood on the ground, and Maggie did not seem to be conscious. She said John was arrested and Maggie was taken back to her own home, and a doctor was sent for. Anne Boyle said she lived in Millen Street in Gateshead opposite Maggie. She said she had seen Maggie, Ivy and John in the street that day. They appeared to be arguing. Later she said she saw Maggie run over the road and John behind her pointing the gun at her as she ran. She said she heard the sound of a shot, and as Maggie got into the passage she had tried to stop John from getting in, but he was able to force his way in, and she heard him fire the gun again twice. She said after this she ran out of the back of her house to get some help. Lizzie Bennett said she lived with Anne Boyle and Anne Boyle was her sister, and she gave almost the same evidence, only adding that when Maggie first got into the passage she had crouched behind the door, but she had seen John force the door, the revolver in his hand, and he had aimed it at Maggie's head and fired. After this she said he had tried to put his arms around Maggie's neck, and she had cried, "I am killed, I am killed." She said John got closer to her and Maggie said, "Don't, John, I love you." Lizzie said she did not see any more after this. Dr. Abraham said when he had examined Maggie at her home on the night of the shooting, he was immediately aware of how seriously ill she was, and he did not expect her to live. He felt that there was a bullet lodged in her brain and nothing could be done for her. He said her sister had taken care of her and she had died the following day from her injuries. Dr. Abraham said he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of Maggie Lieutand, and he said internally the organs were all in very good condition. However, he had removed a bullet from the brain which had caused serious damage, and he said it was his professional opinion that death had been caused by lacerations to the brain, hemorrhage and shock to the system. The inquest was adjourned at this point and it resumed at Gateshead Town Hall on the Saturday, and the first witness called was Henry Smith. Henry said he was a draper's traveller and he lived in North Shields. He said he had been in Millen Street in Gateshead on the day of the crime to visit a home close to Maggie's. He said he saw Maggie, Ivy and John on the street that day. He said they were arguing quite loudly but he was not able to hear what they said. He saw John try to get into the house and run up the stairs, and he saw the two women trying to force him out. He said that once outside he saw John put his hand into his coat pocket and pull out the revolver. He saw him fire the first shot at Maggie, but he did not think that he had hit her. He said he saw Maggie run over the road and saw John catch up to her and try to force his way into the passage of the house opposite. He had his arm and leg inside the door and he heard him fire a shot. After this he said he saw John get completely inside and he then heard a second shot. He did not go for the police, but one came into the street a short time later, and he said he followed the policeman to the door, and when it was opened John was holding Maggie in his arms and there was blood on her head and on the ground beside her. Charles Atkinson said he worked in Blackhead Street in Newcastle, and he said he worked in a shop that was a general dealer's, and that among other things they sold guns. He said on the day of the crime a man had come into the shop to buy a gun, but he could not say for sure that this man was John Thompson. He was then asked why he had not taken more notice of the man, and he said that the man was only in the shop for 2 to 3 minutes, as he was happy with the gun and bought it quickly. The revolver was then produced, and Charles said he believed it was very like the gun that he had sold that day. Although it did not have any marks on it to identify it as having been sold in his shop, he said they did not do this, but he still felt sure it was the same gun. Charles Watson said he was a gun maker and had a shop close to Mr. Atkinson's in Clayton Street in Newcastle. He said on the day of the crime he had sold a box of 50 cartridges to John Thompson. He said John had taken the gun from his coat pocket so that he could be shown how to load it. And Charles Watson said he believed that the gun produced was the same one he had seen that day. Sergeant Coburn said he had been called to Millen Street in Gateshead at around 2 p.m. He said on entering the passage where Maggie had ran to, he found John on the ground with Maggie in his arms, partly lying on the stairs. He said he had asked John who has done this, and he replied, "I've done it." He said he then asked him where the revolver was, and John had put his hand into his pocket for the gun. Sergeant Coburn said he had quickly took it from him. He said he had then taken John to the police station. He said he telephoned for a doctor and returned to the scene. He then helped to carry Maggie back to her own home and into bed. He said he had found the hat that she had been wearing, and it had 2 bullet holes in it that matched the 2 wounds to her head. And he said she'd also been wearing a cape, which was also found at the scene, and the bloodstains on it matched the area in her armpit where another wound had been found. He said after Maggie's death he had charged John with her willful murder, and he did not make any comments. The coroner then spoke to the jury, and he said there was no doubt that the gun had been bought for the purpose of killing Maggie, but was there any doubt in their minds that John had been the man to buy the gun that day? He then said he did not feel that there was any case for manslaughter, and if the jury believed that John was the guilty man, then the only verdict could be one of willful murder. The jury, without retiring and with only a brief discussion, returned a verdict of guilty of willful murder against John Thompson, and he was committed for trial. The funeral of Maggie Lieutand was held on September the 20th at Gateshead Cemetery. Although very little was reported about it in the papers at the time, it was said that her father and sister were the chief mourners, and that also in attendance were several other family members and many of her female friends. The coffin was said to be covered with several wreaths. No mention was made of her husband attending, but perhaps he was still at sea at the time. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Maggie anywhere in Gateshead Cemetery. The trial took place in Durham in November of 1901 before Mr. Justice Grantham. John was said to be quiet and subdued and pleaded not guilty to the charge of murder. As is often the case, the evidence at the trial was very much the same as at the inquest, so I will only include any new information. Henry Smith gave the same evidence as he had done at the inquest. However, he stated that when he had seen John following Maggie with the revolver, he had hidden out of the way. The judge was not at all impressed at this, and he asked him why he had not made any efforts to attack John and take the gun from him. He said Henry should be ashamed of himself, as he could easily have saved Maggie's life if he had not been such a coward. The defence said he would be calling several witnesses who would testify as to the prisoner's state of mind. He believed that John was suffering from insanity. He said that 7 years earlier a heavy spanner had fallen onto John's head, and although the damage had not been permanent, he felt it had predisposed the brain to disease. And also 2 or 3 years after this, John had caught syphilis, which undoubtedly had gone to the brain. He added that the prisoner's actions all went to support this theory, such as buying a gun before there had even been an argument between the couple. But if the jury were not satisfied with this, then surely they should see that he acted in a moment of madness after great provocation from the deceased. He then called the following witnesses. Dr. Willis of Newcastle said he had studied mental health for several years. He had attended to John Thompson for around 7 years. He said he had performed an operation on him at the very first time that he had met, and this we can assume was connected to the spanner incident. He stated that afterwards, for a short time, John had been very excitable, trying to damage everything and anything near him. And he said that over the past 5 years he had seen John many times, and he often complained of bad headaches. And Dr. Willis said this led him to believe that John's brain was affected. He said he had seen him recently prior to the murder, and John had appeared to him to have a dull, vacant look about him. And John had also told him, "If my head does not get better, I will blow my own brains out." He said he had discussed treatments with John, but he had declined any treatment for his bad heads. He believed that John was suffering from syphilitic insanity, and a severe blow to the head would make him more likely to suffer from this disease, and the headaches were a symptom of this too. Dr. Lyle said he was a specialist in mental and nervous diseases. He had examined John Thompson at Durham Prison, and he too believed that he was suffering from syphilitic insanity. He did not go into further detail, but he seems to have only visited John in prison on one occasion. Anne Thompson said John was her brother, and she felt that over the past few years her brother had changed from being a kind and caring and quiet man to being loud and angry, and that on the day before the murder he had complained to her of having had another headache. The prosecution were quick to call their own specialist witnesses to discuss their thoughts on the state of mind of John Thompson. And Dr. Gilbert said he was the medical officer of Durham Prison. He said in his opinion the prisoner was quite sane. He had not shown any signs of insanity, and all of the symptoms described by both Dr. Willis and Dr. Lyle were indeed consistent with syphilis, but this did not mean that the prisoner was also suffering from insanity. Dr. St. John Skeen, the medical superintendent of Durham County Lunatic Asylum, said he had examined John Thompson during his time at Durham Prison, and he felt that the prisoner was quite sane, displaying no signs of insanity. The prosecution then addressed the jury, stating that John was guilty of a cruel and calculated murder, having bought the revolver after Maggie had refused to speak to him for the purpose of taking her life. The defence spoke one last time to say that while John may not show enough signs of insanity to have him committed to an asylum, he had indeed been suffering from an attack of insanity at the time of the murder, and he had truly bought the revolver with the intention of taking his own life. John Thompson did not give evidence on his own behalf. The judge, in summing up, said he did not think the prisoner was insane, and he thought that it was ridiculous to suggest that John had bought the revolver with the intention of taking his own life, when he had clearly bought it on the day of the crime, and only after Maggie had made it clear that she did not want anything more to do with him. The jury retired for merely 5 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of willful murder, but with a strong recommendation to mercy. The judge, now wearing the black cap, addressed John Thompson, stating, "You have been found guilty of the most terrible crime, and no one who has heard the evidence could have found differently. The jury have recommended mercy, and this will be passed to the proper authorities in due course. Your sentence is one of death by hanging, and that your remains will be buried within the walls of Durham Prison." John, who had said nothing throughout the trial, listened carefully to the judge's words, and he was then removed to the cells below and returned to Durham Prison. A lower petition for a reprieve for John Thompson was started, and details were sent to the Home Secretary. A letter was received at the beginning of December stating that there would be no reprieve, and the death sentence would be carried out within the following few days. It was said that during his time in prison, John had not had much hope of a reprieve, and when he had been told that it had not been granted, he had taken the news calmly, showing no signs of distress. John had never spoken of the crime while in prison. In fact, he had said he did not remember it at all, only once speaking of it when discussing the details of the trial, but still saying that he himself could not remember it. The Reverend W. Jackson visited him frequently in prison, but it was said that he barely took notice of anything the man said. He had a final visit the week before the execution. I am so not starting again at this late stage, so I am sorry for that one. He had a final visit the week before the execution from his mother and sisters, and this was the only time that he seemed to show any signs of sorrow at the position he was in. No doubt it was thought because of the distress shown by his family on their visit. The execution took place at Durham Prison on the morning of December the 10th, 1901. The night before the execution, John was said to be his usual calm self, sleeping fairly well, but that he was awake and dressed by 5 a.m. He did not eat, choosing only to drink his tea. The Reverend Jackson again visited and remained with him until the end. However, John had not wanted this, wishing to be left alone. The executioner was at first to be James Billington. However, he had been taken ill, and at the last minute he had to be replaced. And it is worth noting that James died in December of 1901, just a few days after the execution took place. The execution of John Thompson was handed to the sons of James Billington, William and Thomas. And on their arrival they very quickly pinioned John Thompson. This means that his arms would be tied at the wrist. Sometimes this was done at the front of the body and sometimes at the back. John, with the Reverend Jackson following, was then led to the gallows. He was said to walk with a brave step, though those watching felt he was not as brave as he appeared. He then walked firmly onto the drop. William and Thomas then adjusted the ankle straps that they had added and placed the white cap over John's head and stepped back, giving the signal to remove the bolt, and John fell. His death was said to be instant. The black flag was then raised over the walls of the prison to allow those who had gathered outside to know that the punishment required by law had been carried out. And afterwards it was stated that this had been one of the fastest hangings to ever take place at Durham, taking less than 3 minutes. After the usual time of 1 hour, the body was removed and placed into a plain and simple coffin. This was then buried within the grounds of Durham Prison. It was stated that afterwards the ground would be rolled flat so as not to show any signs that a burial had taken place. No markers were placed, and only maps held within the prison itself would show where the bodies of those hanged could be found. I found this to be a very strange case. No details were ever given as to why John and Maggie had parted ways. It was suggested that she had said something about his mother that had upset him, but no details were ever given, as I say. He had accused her of being a drunken liar at one point, but no evidence is ever given of Maggie being someone who drank a lot, and John is never described as being a drinker either. So was this just a simple case of jealousy? That Maggie did not want him, so he did not want anyone else to have her either. It's really hard to pin it down to that, as really there's no evidence to support that theory either. So the reason for this crime, to me, remains a mystery. Was he insane, as several of the doctors suggested at the trial, or did he act out of madness? Or was he perfectly sane but crazy with rage at the fact that Maggie had rejected him? I have to admit that I really am struggling to find any reasons for what really does seem to be a senseless murder of a young woman. Were the jury right to find him guilty of murder? Well, based on the evidence, I feel, as the judge said, there was no other verdict they could have reached. Was it right that he was hanged? Well, it seems that if we are to believe that he bought the gun for the purpose of shooting Maggie, then yes, it was, as this would have clearly made it premeditated murder. What grounds they had for recommending mercy, though, I have to say I struggled with, as the judge had said that it was provocation by Maggie, but refusing his advances and refusing not to speak to him does not really feel like provocation to me. But what do you think? Do you think John was insane, or do you think he acted out of rage and jealousy? Do you think that Maggie's refusal to speak to him alone was enough to tip him over the edge and decide to kill her? Do you think the jury was right to find him guilty of murder, or do you think he did have some grounds to be found guilty of manslaughter? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and very tragic story interesting, and I do apologise. As I said, I knew this was going to be quite a long story, so I do hope that you have stuck with it to the end, and I do apologise for the mistakes that I made. It is looking at a sort of 30-minute video and really is quite difficult to record, and my mouse was playing silly games as well and was keep moving up so that I was having difficulty to read my notes, which didn't help. But anyway, as I say, before I make it any longer, I do hope that you have found this sad and very tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching. I do apologise for my mistakes, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.